and we'll get started. All right, welcome. We are on day 2 of module 1, lesson 3. Okay, we're talking about Articles of Confederation. So we started the notebook last class and stuff. So we got through like the first, I think, halfway through number 4. So if you missed those, you'll want to go back and watch the first video. And then we're going to be doing the second half today. I also will be giving you your review sheets today for the assessment, the quiz. Okay. All right, so when we are in Canvas, right, you can go to that live session recording page. This is where you can find all the documents for the week, including the review sheet for the quiz, okay, and then playbacks and stuff. So by the time we're done recording this, then I'll post this also on that live session page. All right, I'm gonna go to modules. We're gonna go to module 1, lesson 3, Articles of Confederation. And we left off in the readings, okay? So remember, that's where you get your notebook right here, okay? You open it up, remember, save it to your drive, make it shareable. We did the essential question, the supporting question, how does the U.S. Constitution address the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? So yesterday we talked about problems with the Articles of Confederation, and then today we'll talk about the writing of and how the U.S. Constitution gives the federal government more power, okay? So try to correct the issues they had from the Articles. We went over the vocab words: encroachment, inherent, precedent, ordain, implied. Okay. Next page. Okay, so we talked about the Articles of Confederation. We watched a video. We did the checking for understanding, and we did this section of the notebook. Where we left off was on the Federalist Papers. So go ahead. So you want to have your notebook open. Okay, we did 1, 2, the vocab, we did 3, and we did the first part of number 4. So this is where we're going to pick up today. So go ahead and give me a thumbs up emoji once you have your notebook open, you're ready to go, and we're going to pick up where we left off. Any questions before we get started? All right, we're good? All right, let's do this. All right, so we left off. Oh, hey, Tamia. So we're just getting started. So go ahead and open up your notebook from yesterday, and we're going to pick up at number 4. Does that work? Okay. Yep. So I'm just in Canvas, just where we left off. So I've just been kind of saying, hey, and then we're just getting started. So you're all good. All right. So where we left off with the Federalist Papers, okay, basically in 1787, as you can see right here, okay, a delegate from each state, so a representative from each state came together, and they knew because of the problems they were going to have, or they were having with the Articles of Confederation, they either had to modify it or they had to rewrite it. Well, quickly they realized they were going to have to rewrite it because it took all 13 people to agree in order to modify or amend the Articles of Confederation, which meant it was never going to happen. So they basically had to rip it up. They didn't actually rip it, but start over. Okay. So when they're starting over, this was not like a quick thing. This took months. Okay. This took months of coming back and discussing and then redoing and writing different sections of the Constitution. The Constitution has many, many different parts. It's many, many different pages. So during that time, what was happening is that representatives from states that supported a stronger federal government, like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, would write these pamphlets called the Federalist Papers, and they would post them in the newspapers. They would hand them out around town, and this was really centered kind of in New York and DC. The Anti-Federalists, so some of those, John Hancock, Patrick Henry, James Monroe, would write counter arguments papers that they would publish in the local newspaper. These are all trying to influence the public. You want a stronger federal government? Oh, no, be careful, and trying to talk about pros and cons and convince people what they should or shouldn't do. So before the writing of the Constitution, there was a lot of negotiation and trying to convince the public of what these changes would be, because the public was nervous, of course, because this is the founding document, right, that our whole country runs on. So we're going to watch a quick video on what the Federalist Papers are, okay? And then we'll go in and we'll answer more of our questions and do the checking for understanding.
The Federalist Papers, it's a set of documents written for the New York population who would be voting on ratification. And it happens that these documents were written by 3 of the leading Federalists, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay. in these documents, you have the defense of the Constitution. To read them closely is to read not just why the Federalists thought the Constitution should be ratified, but in some ways, more importantly, you can see how they respond to criticism. The two most important issues that the Anti-Federalists raised with the Constitution was one, that it didn't go far enough toward direct representation, that it went too far the other direction, towards virtual representation, so that there weren't enough representatives in the House of Representatives, and therefore the voices of many people would be lost. The Federalist Papers have to address this issue. Madison, most famously, addresses, among other things, how a smaller House of Representatives than what the Anti-Federalists wanted could actually be effective, and actually more effective and more democratic than the kind of legislature that the Anti-Federalists would have. The second biggest gripe that the Anti-Federalists had about the Constitution is that there was no Bill of Rights. This made no sense to them. Every state had a Bill of Rights. The English kingdom that they had broken from had a Declaration of Rights that had been the inspiration for the Glorious Revolution, which had filtered into America almost a century before. The Federalists have to respond to this issue. And what you then have, because of this debate, is really the earliest and most fascinating debates in United States history on what are rights, how do you make them, or do you make them explicit? How do you protect them? What's the advantage of putting them in writing? What are the disadvantages of putting them in writing? And Madison is fascinated by this topic. He is insistent on not having a Bill of Rights. And here's what sounds counterintuitive, that if you have a Bill of Rights, they will actually be limiting on rights. He worried that if you list rights as the state constitutions, you are bound to forget some. And then the fact that some have been forgotten or neglected will be used to deny those very forgotten rights to people. So reading the Federalist Papers, what you have is a document that exposes this debates. Also, you have to remember, these are pamphlets intended for the common reading public. It's meant to persuade. And therefore, parts of it are actually compelling. Are they boring? Yes, to today's eye, they can certainly be boring in places and address issues and use language that seems antiquated to us. But there are these moments in the Federalist Papers where you realize they speak to us directly today. And that's rather remarkable for a set of documents that is more than 200 years old and written for an audience that could not be more different from Americans today.
Okay, so yes, he says a couple things that are very accurate. First, the Federalist Papers are very long. Don't worry, we're not going to read all of them. Okay, we're here to get the spirit of them or the gist of them, and then how they influence the Constitution. But basically, they're these series of letters, right, and pamphlets to try to convince the public, because again, they're going to be voting, so they have to write this Constitution, but it can't be ratified unless the people vote to approve it. So it's just like anything. It's a debate. It's a persuasive argument, right? You're trying to bring people to your side or that side, you know. Think like we do in political elections. We have campaigns, we have debates, right? We have political ads, right? Trying to pull us toward one party or the other. In this case, before there were political parties, the first political parties were Federalists, Anti-Federalists, trying to pull people to their vision of what this reformed government would look like, okay? And trying to address the concerns of people and convince them one way or another of this, okay? A big one was the Bill of Rights, and we will talk about that more in the next week or two, all right? So let's go back over into Canvas, okay? I think they do a really good job of overviewing. So the Federalist Papers were papers that were put out during the year of, you know, it said 3 basic authors right here from October of 1787 to August of 1788, dozens of papers put out that are pro or against having a more centralized federal government. And what does that look like? Okay, and lots of arguments for and against. Okay. So if we go to number 4, okay, we did look at the first one, and this, I'll just review this one. What are 2 questions you would ask the framers about the interpretation of the law? Explain why you are asking those questions. So think, if you were the public, what might be a question you might ask these Federalists or anti-Federalists as they're rewriting the Constitution? So why does Congress need more power? Because remember, in the Articles of Confederation, Congress didn't have very much power. And one of the big pushes is that they were pushing to have a central leadership position called the president, kind of to replace the idea of a monarch. And so, of course, there was a lot of fear that we would just basically create a dictator. So why do we need that? And explaining, no, like this person is, in charge of the country, but they are limited and they must follow the law. And there's very strict guidelines for them. But that way we have central leadership and a figurehead. So trying to explain how it's good for us. We want leadership, but how we won't go all the way over into having a monarch again. Because there was rightfully concerns, right? Nobody wanted to repeat what they had experienced in Great Britain. How does the debate between Federalists and Anti-Federalists clearly spell out the differences in their thinking between the founders as they write the Constitution? There's some really obvious differences in those beliefs. So I'll put this in the chat and we'll talk about them. Okay, so the obvious differences is that Federalists believed in having a stronger central government. Here, and I can even make this a little bigger. There we go. Oops, too big. All right, they believed in having a stronger central government, okay? They wanted to have 3 branches. In the Articles of Confederation, there was only 1. Our 3 branches today are the executive, which is president, legislative, which is the House and the Senate, and then the judicial branch, okay, which is our Supreme Court. The Anti-Federalists believe in having they believe that there should be state governments. The state government should supersede federal, okay? So there was this big disagreement of, should states have more power or should the federal government have more power, all right? And this was, again, the Constitution definitely is going to favor the Federalists. So when they put in the BOR, that's Bill of Rights, just abbreviation for it, the Bill of Rights was a list, or is a list, I should say, really clearly defining what are our rights. Each state had them. England had it. So it was a way to compromise with the Anti-Federalists. So we ended up going with more of the Federalist point of view of what the new Constitution should look like. We need more centralized government. The central government is going to have more power than the states. But we will add this clause, this list of 10 Bill of Rights, clearly stating the rights of the states and the people living within the states that the federal government can't control. Okay, so freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, right to bear arms, right to a trial, no search and, no unreasonable search and seizure. You can't search without a warrant, no housing, quartering of soldiers, on and on and on, right? That's where we get all of these. This was the Anti-Federalists basically saying, all right, we can have a federal government, but I want to make sure that you respect my personal rights, that it's not just each state has rights, that every state has the same guaranteed rights, protection from the federal government. All right, let's go over to checking for understanding, okay? And so we're going to start the quiz. And remember, these are awesome because they help with toward the quiz. A lot of times these pop up on the quiz, okay? So in the Federalist paper number 51, like I said, there was a lot of them. When Madison argues that the great security against the gradual concentration of several powers in the same department consists of giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachment on the other, he is referring to the constitutions, and that's the checks and balance system. So a lot of people who were anti-federalists, who were anti-federal government, were afraid, again, of having a dictator, that it would get too powerful and there would be nothing to restrict its power. So Madison is trying to assure people, hey, we put in checks and balances. All 3 branches of government are equal to each other and can correct each other. No one branch has all power. So by creating these checks and balances between the 3 branches, when the president gets out of line, the legislative branch can put him back in place. When the legislative branch tries to pass a law that's unconstitutional, then the judicial branch can put them back in place. When the judicial branch maybe tries to say more than they should, then the legislative and say, oh no, you're just there to interpret the Constitution. So they can push each other back in their lane when they overstep. Read the excerpt from Federalist 51, 1788 in the passage. What does Madison seem to identify as the greatest threat to a good government? All right. And he is going to, in this preamble, basically say human nature. And we've talked about this a little bit. Human nature is we naturally like power, right? And when we get power, it's scary sometimes how what you thought was a nice person can go awry, can go astray. And it happens all the time. And so you have to have those places, you have to have those boundaries in place because people naturally, unfortunately, overstep what they're supposed to do. The series of letters known as the Federalist Papers was written by all the following except, okay? So it's going to be written by John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. Those are all listed right up here, okay? The only one who did not write them, but was our first elected president, is George Washington. The author of the Federalist Papers argued in favor of proposed constitution, saying that basically the system of checks and balances would strengthen the democracy and protect the individual. So it's like it's going to do both. We're going to be stronger as a country because we have centralized leadership, but through the protections of the Bill of Rights and the checks and balances that all three branches are equal and have different roles, it will protect us individuals from them overstepping too far. Oops, I guess I need to select my answer. Where did it go? Checks and balances, here it is. Okay, so finish. Okay, and then we're going to go on to U.S. Constitution. Anyone have any questions before I move on? Give me a thumbs up. You're doing okay. We're doing okay. All right, so this is going to be U.S. Constitution, which is going to be number 5 on the notebook, right? Okay, so let's take a look at that, and then I have a short video on the U.S. Constitution. So once they actually write it, what is some of the content, you know? So they have this chart for us, and it says weaknesses from the article and how is it fixed in the Constitution, all right? So we're going to watch the quick video, and then we'll go through and we'll fill out this chart looking at the powers that they gave the federal government through the Constitution. Okay, and there are 3 types of power that they give in the Constitution. They give express power, inherent power, and implied power, okay? That was not there in the Articles of Confederation. So there's a lot of power that's handed over, but there's different kinds of power, all right? So let's talk about those different kinds of power and then how that plays out. All right.
Let's get real here for a moment. You're
After
an
this ad.
amazing electrician, but you're not exactly looking forward to the year. You see.
Hi everyone. This video is about the powers our Constitution gives the government. After watching this video,
I'm trying to figure out where the issue
is to read not just why the Federalists
Where's
thought the
the
Constitution
video?
should be ratified, but in
Oh
some
my
ways, more
goodness.
importantly, you can see how they respond to criticism.
Oh, it's on the page. I was like, what is going on? Okay, let's try that again. All right, sorry about that. I was like, why am I hearing 2 different things? All right, here we go.
hi everyone. This video is about the powers our Constitution gives the government. After watching this video, you should be able to categorize powers delegated to the national government. Now remember, we have a limited government, which means that the government can only do the things that the Constitution gives it power to do. These powers the government gets from the Constitution are called delegated powers, and there are 3 types of them. They are express powers, implied powers, and inherent powers. We are going to look at express powers first. Express powers are those things that the government can do that are specifically written in the Constitution. For example, in Article 1, Section 8, the Constitution specifically says that the Congress has the power to coin money, regulate commerce, or declare war. These are express powers because they are specifically written into the Constitution. There are also implied powers in the Constitution. These are powers that are not specifically written out like the express powers, but the express powers do strongly suggest that the government has these implied powers anyway. For example, in Article 2, Section 2, the Constitution makes the president the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy. The president's power as commander-in-chief is an express power, but the president is also commander-in-chief of the Air Force. The Constitution doesn't mention the Air Force. It would be weird if it did mention the Air Force. The Constitution was written in the 1780s. Why would it mention the Air Force? But since the Air Force is another branch of the armed forces, the Constitution suggests that the president is commander-in-chief of the Air Force too. Therefore, that is an implied power because it isn't written, but strongly suggested. One of the main sources of the government's implied powers comes from Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, which says that the government can make all laws that are necessary and proper. That implies that the government can make laws about issues that might not be directly mentioned in the express powers of the Constitution. In addition to being called the necessary and proper clause, this part of the Constitution is also called the elastic clause because it can stretch what the government can do under the framework of the Constitution. Finally, the government also has inherent powers. So it's best to define inherent first. And warning, after I define inherent, I'm going to speak vaguely for a moment, and then I will provide more specific details concerning the government. So consider yourself warned. Inherent means that something is an essential character of something, at least according to my friend Merriam-Webster, and he has yet to let me down. For our purposes here, you can even think about something being inherent as being so necessary that it occurs naturally. For example, you have an inherent right to breathe because you're alive, and that right to breathe occurs naturally. Or you have an inherent right to think because you're a person, and just by being a person, you have that right. Well, our government has inherent powers too, just because it exists. Those inherent powers do not necessarily have to be written in the Constitution, but our government has those powers because it's a government, and all governments have those powers. Examples of inherent powers, powers that all governments have, might be regulating immigration or acquiring territory. Now, you might be able to read parts of the Constitution in ways that implies that the government can regulate immigration or acquire territory, but regardless, our government inherently has those powers because all governments have those powers. So now that you've seen this video, you should be able to define and give some examples of the expressed, implied, and inherent powers of our government. So thanks for watching.
Okay, sorry for the delay, but he does a good job of just kind of summarizing. So in this new Constitution, okay, there are three main powers that are given to the government. So this might mean the president, the legislative branch, Supreme Court, or shared. Okay, so we have the express, clearly written in the Constitution. You can X, Y, Z. Okay, you can do this, or you cannot do this. So being really clear. Then we have the implied, like it's not written, but because the good example was the branches of the military, right? So it made clear that the president is the commander-in-chief of the military. Well, as we've created new branches of the military, obviously just implied that those fall under it, right? Even though they're not explicitly written in the Constitution, who else is going to control them? You know, so that kind of, and then you have those inherent powers that maybe aren't clearly written out, but it's just like, you know, kind of like, I'm a mom, so there's just certain things that I do. It's not like someone had to write it down. Like I make sure that my kids have their lunch each day when they go to school. It's not like it's written down. Now, as a mom, you're going to make sure that they have their lunch every day for school. Like that's just one of the things I do, you know, when they grow out of their clothes that we're replacing them, you know, like there's just certain things that it's assumed, right, that I'm going to take care of or that I'm going to do, even if it's not written down somewhere. Okay, because it goes along with the duties of the role you've taken on. So like a government, a good example would be like regulating borders. Every country does that, right? Every country has borders and the government does things to secure those borders, right? To ensure that they're protected and that there's a clear line between one country and another. All governments do that. So it's just inherent. It's just what you do because you have that role. All right, so let's go over into Canvas, okay, and stuff. So we're going to go over to our notebook. All right, so weaknesses that were in the articles and how were they fixed in the Constitution. So here's one. All right, there was no executive. There was no central leadership. So they didn't want a king. So we solved that by putting the executive branch, aka the president. So another example, there was no federal judiciary, aka court system. What do we do when we're arguing over a law, how we interpret a law? Two people could read the same thing and get different interpretations depending on what their motives are, right? Depending on what the circumstances and they're trying, it happens all the time. So we need some superior court to help, you know, define our Constitution when there's questions, but also to make decisions when we get to impasses. You know, it's the way you have stability. Even if you don't like the outcome, there has to be a standard. What is it going to be? There has to be a decision. Otherwise, you would have warfare all the time. And obviously, that's not our goal. There was no standing army. We have no protection then for this new government. Each state had an army, but we needed, if we're going to be united, then we need to have a united army, one army, right? So we kind of flipped what there used to be. So now each state has their National Guard that's there to help with local things and stuff like that, but then also they can be called for federal level. And then federally, right, that's where the bulk of our military is. And stuff is at federal level. So if you or if anyone in your family or something has served or is currently serving, right, they are serving federally. Okay, that's a federal. Now, reserves by state, that is then more local, that's state level. There was no way to collect taxes under the Articles of Confederation. Remember, it was optional. And I'll even admit, if taxes are optional, I'm keeping them. All right, at least a good chunk of them. I'll pay the school or the teachers. I appreciate what they do. But you know, like, nobody wants to pay taxes. Nobody likes doing that. So they had to put a way to get the federal government to actually be able to collect taxes, because you can't run a government without money. Now, the big question is how much money, which a lot of people would argue they need more, they need less, you know, whatever. But if we're going to have a government, they do need to have a budget. They need to have money. And then all states had a single vote. Remember, that was the unicameral. Everyone had one representative, one vote. All was the same, but this created inequality with the larger states and the smaller states. And so the larger states felt like, hey, we make up the majority, we should have a larger voice. So they compromised in the new Congress, right, creating a bicameral Congress. So the House of Representatives is based on population. The more your population, the more representatives. The Senate is across the board, right? Doesn't matter your size, whatever, every state gets 2 reps. So they kind of took part of what they had, carried that over into the Senate instead of 1 rep, 2, but then created a secondary branch in that Congress that was based on the size, okay? So that, yes, if you have more population, you have a little bit more weight in the decisions, but you have the Senate so that the small states aren't being steamrolled. So it's a way to kind of honor both. It's we'll talk to this when we get to social issues, the majority rule versus minority rights, minority groups, however you define that. And again, that can mean many different things, depends on the topic, right? It can be broken up in many different ways. Whatever the majority is, they have a right to be heard. They're the majority. But you can't do it at the expense of the minority group on whatever the topic is, okay? Whatever the topic or the circumstance is. So this is a way to try to deal with that, to give a majority voice, but also not have minority rights, smaller states being railroaded. And that's sometimes it's not perfect, but it's as close as we can get. All right, let's go back over and let's do the checking for understanding. There's quite a few questions on this one. How does the Constitution balance between small and large states, okay, with regards to legislative power? All right, so they did a bicameral nature of Congress, right? So they created 2, one that was based on size and one that was just based on everyone gets the same representation. The Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was not part of the original Constitution. However, it was added in 1791, and this was a compromise between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So Federalists got their way with the Constitution. So the way that they got the Anti-Federalists to vote for it was the promise of and then adding of the Bill of Rights that specifically made it clear the limitations of the government to keep them from having a tyrannical government. And you know what? All the time, we are thankful for those, right? We are thankful for freedom of speech, that we can disagree with our government, or we can question things, or we don't have to just agree because something's happening. Freedom of religion, we can practice the religion we want, or we don't have to, you know, freedom to protest, you know, freedom to petition, you know, these are big things that not everyone has. Amending the Constitution is a difficult process that became increasingly difficult in each step. Why is that? All right. The framers, you know, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So they felt that in order for it to be stable, it can't just be changed on a whim. Just because we have a new president that is from a different political party, that they can go in and just change everything. Well, then what happens the next election when the other extreme gets into power and then they go and change everything? It creates huge shifts and waves. And the goal is to create as much consistency as possible for stability. So you don't want it to be easy to change. If it's easily changed, then it's like a house. You want a house to be really stable, right? A building to be really stable. If I can go up and just push it, it'll fall over, right? I want to take a lot to push that over or to change something about that. Think of it in the same way, the foundation that we are built on. The Constitution grants the federal government 3 types of powers. That's what we just went over. So that's expressed, implied, and inherent. The core purpose of the checks and balances is and that's to prevent any one branch or person from becoming too powerful. Because again, the anti-federalists were concerned if we have a central leadership, they're just going to become like another king. So the federalists were trying to say, look, they will each have power, but they will keep each other in check. And if anyone gets out of balance, if the president, if the legislative, if the courts, then the others have power to go in and correct them. And they're each responsible for different things to balance out. Referring to the table on the Articles of Confederation, U.S. Constitution, what is a difference between the two? Okay, what is a difference between the two? Let's see, state population were a factor in votes under the U.S. Constitution. That's true. No Congress existed. No. The government under the Articles of Confederation had a large court. No. Reference table, what is a difference between the two? No judicial branch. Okay, so I'm pretty sure it's this one. Yes. So all of a sudden, state population became important with representatives in the legislative vote, which didn't happen the first time. Referring to the table of the Articles of Confederation, U.S. Constitution, which sentence expresses a similarity between the two governments, okay? They both had a Congress. So they both did have a Congress. They did not both have 3 branches. Articles had 1, Constitution had 3. Both had access to tax. No, the Articles of Confederation, they were not able to tax. And they both had an executive branch. No, the Constitution with the president has an executive branch. But both did have a Congress. All right. So we can select finish. We got that one done. And then we're going to go to federal or state versus federal. All right. So go ahead and give me a thumbs up. You got number 5 done. You did the checking for understanding questions and you're ready for state federal. So this will be number 6. We have this, the primary source, and then we'll be done. I'm hoping about 20 more minutes and then you'll have 20 minutes to finish up the last few sections. Okay. So it is a lot of material. It is a lot of material. So I'm trying to not butcher it in the process also. So go through it at a decent speed, but also not butcher it too much. All right, let's look at our questions. And then there's a short video on what is the new balance now. Now that we've written a constitution, it's been passed, it's been ratified. What is the balance now between state and federal? What powers does the federal government have? What powers does the state have? Okay. And how does that trickle down to local governments like cities and counties and things like that? Okay. So let's look at the questions. Explain how the states were granted powers separate from the federal government. We're going to listen for that in the video. So listen for what articles or amendments. And then what did the 9th and 10th amendments guarantee? Okay. So again, remember the Bill of Rights is all about satisfying the anti-federalists, satisfying that they were afraid of federal overreach, being too powerful, and they wanted to protect state and individual rights. Okay. So let's look at how that is done.
What we're going to do in this video is talk a little bit more about federal powers versus state powers. And as we've mentioned in other videos, this is a very relevant topic because even today you'll have Supreme Court decisions being decided based on citing different parts of the Constitution or various amendments that seem to give one power or another more to the federal government or to the state government. And another important appreciation is the balance of power or the shifts of power between federal and state. It has historically changed over time, so it isn't this fixed thing. So in a previous video, we talked about the enumerated powers that the Constitution gives the federal government. In particular, we have talked about the Commerce Clause that allows the federal government to regulate commerce among the several states, which has turned out to be a much farther reaching power than maybe the drafters of the Constitution intended. And then the thing that really gives power to even the enumerated powers is the necessary and proper clause, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. And so this is what we talk about, this necessary and proper clause creates a lot of implied powers. So you can imagine this isn't the necessary and proper clause is not something that made the anti-federalists very happy. They were worried about kind of power grabs by the federal government. And so you have the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments. And the 9th and 10th Amendment in particular are anti-federalists' attempt to limit the federal government's power. So the 9th Amendment says, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And even more important, the 10th Amendment, and this is really speaking to federal versus state powers, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, so not delegated to the federal government, nor prohibited by it, the federal government, to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. And so you could view this as reserved powers for the states. It's an anti-federalist attempt to say, hey, you know, the federal government can't just do whatever it wants. It's trying to put a little bit of a check on the necessary and proper clause. So if you fast forward to the period right after the Civil War, you have the 13th Amendment, which bans slavery. And then you have the 14th Amendment, which is trying to bring slaves into society, allow them to be citizens, not just them, but their descendants. And this is in direct contradiction of the 1857 Dred Scott decision that we'll talk about in other videos, where the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that slaves and their descendants are not considered American citizens, and so they don't have a right to petition the government. But the 14th Amendment says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law. And so this is actually putting constraints on states. And so as we'll see, even though this is in the context of the post-Civil War era, because it's putting constraints on states, this is one of the amendments that's often cited that puts more power in the hands of the federal government. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The 14th Amendment has been very relevant in some very current debates. This notion of that in any state, no state can deprive of any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This is often known as the Due Process Clause. And it's this idea that no state can really strip away some of the rights that might be articulated in, say, the Bill of Rights, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. This is often known as the Equal Protection Clause. This is, you could view as a protection against some form of discrimination. And so even in very current debates around things like abortion or same-sex marriage, much of the debate will center around the 14th Amendment.
Okay, so helping you understand and see, one, federal law does supersede state law. So when there's a conflict, federal law, you divert to federal law. Okay. And then also, understanding that the constant balance between federal and state, the pendulum is always shifting. Now, there's some clear things that just they don't get crossed, but there's this constant tug of war, I guess you could say, between federal trying to have more power and state trying to maintain power. And what's happened over time is that states have lost some of their power and federal has gained more power. So if you say, well, which way does it tend to go over time? Over the last 200 years, states definitely have less powers now than they did, let's say, 200 years ago. And there's pros and cons to that. You want to create consistency and equality, but you also don't want to set a pattern where the federal government dictates everything and oversteps, right? You want to have some autonomy within states. That's why people might want to move to a more liberal state or a more conservative state, because they have some ability to create an environment that is more for the people living in that population. So you want some ability to have autonomy, but you also don't want to have so much autonomy that it leads to injustice or, impeding on people's rights. So again, it's this really fine balance that's hard to strike. Okay, explain how the states are granted powers separate from the federal government. So Articles 4 and 10 of the Bill of Rights, okay, Articles 4 and then Amendment 10 and the Bill of Rights and in the Constitution grant all power not explicitly granted to the federal government or denied to the states or solely to the states. So basically, what that means is, if it's not explicitly said in the Constitution that the federal government has the power to do it, then we automatically assume the states have the right. So if you can go and say, oh, the federal government has the state has the right to make that law, but if it doesn't say that, then the state has the right to make their own version of, let's say, a certain law or something. Maybe like speed limits. Let's think about that. Oregon, where I'm from, freeway speeds 55. So slow. Nevada, it's better, like 65 out on the open road, 70, 75. Utah is great. It's like 80 or 90. Montana, Wyoming, there's some areas, there's no speed limit on the freeways. I'm not talking like around town. So if you're doing a road trip, like there's certain states where it's great to drive through because you can make really good time. And there's other ones where you're like, I hate driving through Oregon because I'm like, oh my goodness, like 55, it feels like I could be running faster than that. Not really, but you know what I mean? Like it's so slow. So it's just an example where it doesn't say the federal government can make speed limits. So within states, they have the right to make speed limits. Okay, let's go to the next one. What do the 9th and the 10th Amendments agree on? So the 9th Amendment gives power to the people, and the 10th Amendment gives power to the state, which in both cases is limiting the power of the federal government. So both of these, what they are seeking to do is they are seeking to empower the individual and protect the rights, whether it be at state level from federal overreach or individual, right? That I individually have my rights. Either way, limiting the federal government. Because again, the reason you want states to have some powers is because autonomy. Think about it today. There's definitely a different vibe if you live in California versus if you live in Texas, or if you live in Florida versus New York, or Washington versus Idaho. Like there's a different vibe. There is. One is more liberal, one is more conservative. And you could argue pros and cons, but people are drawn to one or the other. And so in some ways you want people to be able to draw toward what aligns more with their freedoms, right? And what they think is important to them. And that's why having some state autonomy, not entirely, but some state autonomy is important because it creates more living environments that are diverse, that can meet the needs of different people, maybe depending on just a lot of different factors. You know, do you want to live more in a city, or do you like to live more rural? Are you religious? Are you not? What kind of housing are you seeking? Like what's your lifestyle? Like there's a lot of different factors that can go into that. All right, let's do the checking for understanding. Then we have the primary source and we're done. Woohoo. All right, since the establishment of the US government, state powers relative to the national government have generally, and that is decreased. So generally speaking, the federal government has gained more power over states over the last 2 centuries, 200 years, let's say. All right, according to the visual of the 3 branches, okay, sorry, I kind of passed it up. All right. According to the visual of the 3 branches, an example of power shared by both federal and states is, and that's going to be the power to levy and collect taxes. So you pay federal taxes. Everybody has to do that. State tax can come in one of 2 ways. You could pay it by income tax. So right off the top, in Nevada, we don't have income tax. So Oregon, where I'm from, 11% comes out of every check. It just automatically goes to the state. But they don't have sales tax. Nevada, we're opposite. We get to keep the rest of our check after federal taxes. But then if I go buy something, right, we pay that sales tax, right? On top of the price, you pay that tax. That goes to the state. California has both. So you pay income tax of 10% and you pay sales tax of 10%. So some states, California being one of the few, double tax. This is part of the reason California is so expensive, and they have had people moving because it's just so expensive. Being double taxed, usually it's one or the other, but having both, it's like, it's a lot of money. A lot of money that comes out of your check. All right. According to the visual of the 3 branches, a power belonging to the state that is referred to as what kind of power? And that's going to be delegated. Okay, delegated power. So states honestly have the power of what the federal government doesn't control or is handed over to them to decide. They don't have a lot of autonomy. From where do local governments receive their authority? Okay, from the state in which they are located. So every state is different how they delegate power to their counties, to their cities, and how things are taken care of. There are tax systems in every state. Like I said, some have income tax, some have sales tax, property taxes. What's the rate of those? So there is a lot of nuances that are determined and can vary from state to state. The original form of democratic government in America began in, and that is going to be New England town meetings, okay? So even before the Constitution or the Articles of Confederation, even before the Declaration of Independence, there was colonial local government. So this was already planted. That's why people strive to have more of it when Britain was cutting it off. Almost done. Referring to the text in the 10th Amendment, okay? This amendment protects which of the following from an all-powerful federal government. And that is going to be the states and the people. And we just talked about that in number 2 of part 6, right? And then the last one, how does the 10th Amendment of the Constitution limit the power of the federal government? So it reserves all unspecified powers to the states. So if it isn't explicitly stated that the federal government has that authority, then the states get their own autonomy and get to decide. All right, we're going to go to next. We're going to do the primary source together. And then, like I said, we should hopefully have about 20 minutes left, and you can get those last 2 parts of the questions done in the notebook done independently, and then you'll just have your quiz that you have to do. So let's look at the primary source. Okay, which is going to be Federalist Paper number 45. All right, so don't worry, we're not going to read the entire thing. I will summarize it with you. It's one of the benefits of coming to class. All right. They say a lot of things, which is great, but they are a mouthful. This was written 250 years ago, so it can get it can get a little wordy, or some of the words that we don't really use today, and get a little hard to like get to the root of it. So I'll help you with that. All right, so title and description. So again, this is a document that comes directly from the lesson. So this is literally one of those papers, okay, that James Madison wrote that was trying to convince people why having a new system of a federal government would be better. Okay, so title, this is Federalist number 45, Madison's essay stating the Constitution as written allows for a balance of power between state and federal. So this paper in particular, trying to convince people that don't worry, the way we have this Constitution written, it's very clear what the federal government gets to do and what the states get to do. So you don't have to worry about it being unclear. Because each Federalist paper is trying to convince people of different concerns. So this one is trying to, really attach kind of, how do we know that the states will have some autonomy and it's not just a dictatorship? In particular, concept is they're trying to get the new Constitution ratified. So it's been written, but ratified means approved, right? So they're trying to get this to pass. It has to be voted on. And if it's not agreed upon, then they got to go back to the drawing board. So just because they wrote it doesn't mean it's legal. So they're trying to get it ratified. So they need support. They need people to vote. So these Federalist papers are, think of it, it's like a compelling essay. It's like an argumentative essay trying to push you to one side of the issue. Unique features. This essay was originally written for the people of New York and then added to a collection of essays to try to convince, again, the anti-federalists to ratify this new Constitution. So it was different men writing papers, but eventually they kind of took all of them and called them the Federalist Papers, and then took the papers for the anti-federalists and kind of made them as a collection. It's not like they went out to make a collection. It just happened because they were writing this to the people, trying to convince them of how to vote. Again, like campaign ads. So new vocab: American Confederacy, Winikian Confederacy. Oops. Okay, so what is this about? So this kind of breaks it up into different sections. So Madison recognizes the questions of whether or not the states lose power. So he's addressing this concern and says they do not, okay? That the federal government's job is to protect the country from foreign nations and to provide security, not to take away states' rights, okay? So he's trying to reassure of this concern that they're not going to be stripped of all their rights. He goes on to say, he brings up the idea of the abuses of a king relating to smaller states' powers and like small kingdoms, like what we saw in Massachusetts with the Shays Rebellion, okay? And so kind of saying, hey, this will help keep the states in line. This will help create consistency. And with the 3 branches, it'll keep not only the federal government from having an abuse of power, but the states from having an abuse of power, because they will be under the supervision of the federal government. And then the federal government will have the 3 branches, so no one branch can take over or supersede their power. So it's like we're putting all these checks and balances to keep King George 2.0 Britain again from happening. And then finally, he concludes that states will not lose power within the larger federal government, okay? And he gives the example of a federal union and a representative government, okay? And the direct role that the people of each state will have in this. And then kind of the bringing it up, so summing it up, which should basically be bits and pieces from the three, what is it about? In Federalist 45, Madison argues that the Union as outlined in the Constitution is necessary to the people's happiness, and balance of power between states and national government will support the greatest happiness. They're like, we want to ensure states from being too radical. We want to ensure our protection, but also make sure that the federal government is actually protecting you, not controlling you. And we feel that we have done that with these checks and balances. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if your computer glitchy, but in the chat box, some of the text was written twice.
Okay. Well, I can scroll up so you can pick which one. On mine, it's showing once. Oh, there. I guess there's one. It says the essay was originally.
Yeah.
That one was twice, but the other ones I think are once. So just keep going. And it should be Madison recognizes. So that's the first. What is this about? And then the next one, Madison brings. That's the second. And then Madison concludes. That's the third. And then the last one in the Federalist 45. That's bring it all together.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Yeah, sorry, I guess I put the first one in there too many times. Okay, so I'll give you a minute. Give me a thumbs up once you have the primary source chart done. Asia, thanks. Angel, does that mean you have it done, or do you have a question? You got it done?
No, I got it done. I don't know why I did this.
No, it's okay. Awesome. Okay, so we have done a good chunk of this together, right? We did 1 through the first part of 4 on Tuesday, and then we've done the second half today. Okay, so there's 2 parts that are left. There's the journal, okay, where you're going to write 1 or 2 paragraphs. I'm fine with 1 paragraph, but in order to get full points, it needs to be 1 paragraph. That means 5 sentences, okay? Should we interpret the United States Constitution, or should our interpretation of the United States Constitution evolve over time? All right, so yes or no, and give reasons why or why not, okay? And then write about a connection you have on why do you think it is important to learn about this concept, okay? Meaning the key central question, how did the U.S. Constitution address the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? So pull from, I think one of the easiest ways to do that is just pull from this chart. And that last response, you can basically summarize what the problem was and how it was fixed and turn that into a paragraph. Okay, so that's how I would do it. That would make it an easy way to do it, to address this central, how did we go from Articles of Confederation to the U.S. Constitution, and how did it solve the underlying issues that we saw under the first Constitution? Okay. All right, so once you're done with that, you're going to submit it. There's your journal question, bringing it all together. Okay, you do have this checking for vocab, checking for understanding, so you can do that one on your own, and it's just going over the main vocab words. So another good thing you can do to review for your quiz. Here's the submission page, the rubrics, and then here's the quiz. All right, now, before you do the quiz, here is the review sheet, okay? So this is also linked on the live session page where the recordings are, so you can find it there. But go ahead and click on that. Let me know that it opens. Give me a thumbs up or let me know that it's opening for you. It opened? Okay. Awesome. Thank you, Kenya. And stuff. So here's your review sheet. So again, it's got the key concepts, just kind of summaries of each part. It's got some of those review questions, the checking for understanding questions. the vocab. Now you can always add to it if you want. So remember, you can print it off and use it when you take your quiz, or you can leave it open as a tab. Just remember, with the proctor in Honor Lock, you have to let them know about the tab, the accommodation that you can have notes and you can have the tab open. So you just have to tell them that, because they will automatically close it. They have to enable it for it to be open. So you just have to write in the chat or say to them, hey, I have an accommodation, or look at the teacher's accommodations. I'm allowed to have notes open. Can you please enable a tab? And they will see that. Okay, but you have to advocate for it. Otherwise, if it's printed, you can just use it. All right. All right, so we have about 18 minutes left. We're in here till 1:40. So what I would encourage you to do, all right, is to get done 8 and 9, okay? Because the last two parts, you get these done, get it submitted, get your notebook submitted, and then on Friday, you can take your quiz and you're done. All right, you're done for this week. To kind of review, so what's due by this Monday, okay? The notebook, you got the last two sections you're going to do on your own, the review sheet, and then you have that attendance form this Friday and Monday, okay? There are some things closing. So these are closing like for good. I will not reopen them. You send me an email in a week and you're like, I need you to reopen this, blah, blah, blah. No, okay, because I already left it open extra time. Module 1, Lesson 1 notebook is closing. Declaration of Independence worksheet is closing, and Module 1, Lesson 1 quiz is closing this coming Monday, okay? Declaration of Independence and the quiz, those are both summative. So really important that you are on top of that. All right, I am going to send my first failing notices this Friday. So if you have under 60%, those will be sent on Friday afternoon. So if you are behind, you have not been turning stuff in, time to get on it. This is week 3. No more messing around. All right. It's the quickest way to bring up your grade would be Declaration of Independence worksheet. It's worth 40 points. Okay. Second, doing the quizzes. All right. And making sure you're using those notes. All right. I'll be available on Friday from 9 to 11:15. So you're welcome to drop in. The code's on the homepage. All right. So I'll give you about 10, 15 minutes to work on finishing up this notebook. Use your time wisely. All right. And then I'll let you go. But we are staying in here because of attendance. All right. So got a few minutes to work, and then let me know if you have any questions.